Benjamin. Ben.
Glenn, thanks for having me.
You bet. Boy, what a disturbing day on freedom of speech, quite frankly. You've been doing investigation, and it's come out in dribs and drabs here and there. But you hit some things that I think are so important. This report, where I'm a super spreader of misinformation during the last election, is there something more nefarious than just smearing me and the BlazeTV?
Yeah, well, you were in good company with dozens upon dozens, if not hundreds, of other Americans, ranging from the former president of the United States, who was actually targeted for censorship, not only by this quote-unquote public-private partnership that I'm sure we'll talk about, but actually by subordinates in an executive agency alongside journalists and everyday Americans who had their social media posts in 2020 surveilled en masse to the tune of hundreds of millions of tweets looked at by people who probably don't share your politics and our politics, and then had masses of that content flagged to the social media companies to suppress that content. And this public-private partnership was hatched in conjunction with, actually by interns who were working at a federal agency in the national security apparatus. And this is the tip of the iceberg, I think, to a censorship industrial complex, as it's been called, or a public-private censorship regime. And what we reported at RealClearInvestigations are new details about the inner workings of this so-called public-private partnership, who specifically was targeted by it, what speech was targeted, namely protected core political speech in this First Amendment assault, and then how intimately involved government agencies themselves were in getting social media companies to censor Americans, again, en masse, on election administration and election outcomes. The purest political speech, protected First Amendment speech that there is.
What's amazing to me is in this particular narrative that they were squashing of mine, I was warning in September. I did 2 shows in September and October about color revolution and how the playbook, literally the playbook from the Democrats, we had the copy of it. I mean, I show you the pages of it, was putting together what amounted to the same strategy as our State Department's color revolution should Donald Trump win the election. And I warned the president, I warned the people, look for these things. It wasn't to start a color revolution. It wasn't to overthrow the government. It was a warning that people were planning to destabilize the government through some of these organizations, and it was their own plan. How did that become a super spreader of disinformation?
Well, the national security apparatus and its apparent cutouts and force multipliers doing business as academic or research entities or think tanks have taken this idea and put on steroids that wrongthink, disfavored speech about virtually anything of significance itself could pose a threat to our election system, to our public health infrastructure, to our financial services infrastructure, to virtually anything the government can conceive of. And so if you propagate speech that they deem to be delegitimizing or undermining, quote unquote, our democracy, that poses a threat to our democracy, and that is liable to not only be suppressed by the social media companies, that is, on the digital public square, by what have become essentially federally deputized speech police, but you can actually go to jail for it. And we have the perfect example of this in the case that I'm sure you're familiar with of Douglas Mackey, who puts out a tweet in 2016 which says, text your number to vote for Hillary Clinton to this number, hashtag I'm with her. And it's clearly a satirical post. Well, the feds prosecuted him for suppression of voting rights because somebody might have texted their number there to vote for her, not realizing that it wasn't actually a vote. Douglas Mackey was just sentenced a couple weeks ago to 7 months in jail for that satirical tweet. And by the way, that same law is being hung around the neck of Donald Trump in the January 6th case. So there is a censorship-to-criminalization pipeline that's been built, and it's all premised on the idea that if Americans hold ideas that our ruling regime doesn't like, it poses a threat to that regime. They'll say it poses a threat to democracy and that it incites domestic violent extremism. And so there's a national security or public health or protecting of our critical infrastructure justification for the censorship. But what it's really dressing up is quashing of dissent and chilling of dissenters.
So, Ben, where are we headed? I mean, I look at all of the stuff that's happening now with Islamophobia, where they're trying to convince the American people it's Islamophobia that is the real trouble, when we all know that it's anti-Semitism that is growing through the roof right now and a real danger to our way of life. And, you know, they didn't say anything when they were trying to tear the gates down of the White House. And if you think if they couldn't get past that gate, they wouldn't have gone in and, you know, done all kinds of damage to the White House, you're fooling yourself. The White House didn't do anything about that. Nothing. If they control all speech and they can silence people like you or like me when we're talking about the true nature of Hamas, and they decide that we're a problem because we're spreading, by telling the truth, Islamophobia, they wipe us out, and you got no protection for the Jews or anyone else that they decide is on the wrong side.
And you can apply this to basically any aspect of speech that might not comport with what authorized opinions are, according to our ruling elites. There's a very telling quote from the director of CISA, which is this DHS sub-agency, cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency. It's a mouthful, but which is devoted to protecting our critical infrastructure. And the director of that sub-agency, which helped spearhead and was the tip of the spear of the national security state's efforts to surveil and censor speech directly and by proxy, she has said that our most critical infrastructure is our cognitive infrastructure. Translation: mind control is an imperative of the national security apparatus, and it's going to engage in a whole of society effort to ensure the American mind is controlled. Now, on this much more narrow point that you're making, and it's such an important one, this elevation of Islamophobia, which, by the way, Islamophobia is now being raised as the issue of our time in response to the slaughter of Jews at a level of an equivalent of 50,000 Americans, with atrocities on par with, if not more disgusting with, than what occurred during the Holocaust. They are leveraging the slaughter of Jews to silence criticism of the administration and its partners in the Middle East. Because let's not forget, of course, the entire Biden administration policy towards the Middle East, which is really just the third term of the Obama-Biden administration, was to make Iran the strong course, flood its coffers with billions of dollars, not impose sanctions on it, let it build up Hezbollah, Hamas, its other proxies, and make it the dominant power while putting the screws to Israel. So the Biden administration has blood on its hands in the slaughter of Americans and Israelis in Israel, and now they want to use Islamophobia as a way to shut up dissent that points to the disastrous consequences of their policies. That's certainly a part of it. More broadly, if you look at what Islam says about speech, and you use Islamophobia as a pretext to shut people up who want to speak freely and openly, honestly, about Islam and Islamic supremacism, it's basically it's an attempt to impose Islamic speech codes on Americans. Mm-hmm. It's just totally anathema, antithetical to our system. And what this points to is our ruling elites just cannot tolerate any form of dissent. They had a near-death experience with Donald Trump. They had a near-death experience with Brexit. And they can't allow the people to think for themselves, speak for themselves. they have to constrain us and shut us up using ever more disturbing and Orwellian Chinese Communist Party style modus operandi to shut us up.
So, Ben, I've got about 45 seconds. Who's taking this seriously, and is anybody working to dismantle this?
So Republicans in the House primarily, and some in the Senate as well, have tried to put forth legislation to, first, they've done oversight to expose this regime, and second, they've put forth legislation to try and freeze federal speech police from engaging with the social media companies to shut up largely conservative Americans and dissenters on COVIDian orthodoxy and a slew of other issues. Beyond that, there's a massive Supreme Court case. It was called Missouri v. Biden, now Murphy v. Missouri. That is the preeminent case going before the court next term where the Supremes are going to rule on whether federal agencies, including the Biden White House, violated our First Amendment rights through colluding, coercing, cajoling the social media companies to censor wrong thinkers. And another question the plaintiffs in the case have asked the court to take up is whether or not these third-party cutouts as well should be barred from working with the feds to mass surveil and flag for suppression and censorship our speech. So the legislative and judicial avenues are open. We'll see what happens.
Ben, thanks so much. Benjamin Weingarten, Federalist senior contributor and Real Clear Investigations editor-at-large. Appreciate it, Ben. God bless.
Thanks for having me, Glenn. Appreciate it.